Sup folks, time for the part 13, of What If Deku's Cursed Blood Could Reverse Death, Chapter 39, Sinister Omen. Tenya Ida, the youngest son of the famous Ida family, younger brother of the equally famous pro-hero Ingenium, was now facing the realization that he'd taken a lot of things for granted over his short lifetime. Food always on the table, a roof always over his head. But at the moment, he was cursing that he'd always believed his family would always have anything and everything they ever needed on hand immediately as needed. The fact that this introspection was being done in the rather small and plain waiting room of the Rishi National Hospital instead of his family's private practice was not lost on the bespectacled hero in training. Why? The question floated through Tenya's crumbling psyche as he sat there, fruitlessly attempting to reconcile his beliefs with the reality that had led to this disaster. Sitting beside him, his mother, who'd always been a stable and supportive pillar through his childhood, was lost in her own thoughts as well, dabbing under her own glasses every other minute to stem her free-flowing tears. "How?" Tenya shouted into the ether as he sat in his chair, unable to wrap his head around the truth that was the facts of the situation. The turbo hero, Ingenium, had been utterly defeated by the hero killer, Stain. Tenya's older brother, his perfect and invisible idol, had been revealed to be as human as anyone else, as mortal as anyone else. And the youngest Ida could just not understand it. Had it been a case of his brother being blinded by pride? Had he been too arrogant during the fight? No. Tensai was the most humble and level-headed pro Tenya knew. Was it karma, reminding the Ida family that for all their fame and skill, Ingenium had not been anywhere near the top? It couldn't be. Tensai was the pinnacle of what a hero should be. He'd never deserved the uncertain fate he was now facing. Or maybe all of this was for writing Stain off as nothing more than a glorified thug who'd gotten more than a few lucky breaks against other, less experienced heroes? In the end, it didn't really matter, did it? Tensai was fighting for his life regardless, here, at Rishi National. Here, and not at the Ida family's longtime private hospital of choice. Tenya had met the director of that hospital only once before, and for all of his upbringing, couldn't find it in himself to feel anything more than mild distaste for the corpulent man until now. He'd been too aggrandizing in his efforts to assure his parents that his institution could compare to recovery girls at UA for his taste. He'd done nothing but sing praises for how his staff was paid the best to be the best, and regale the Idas with examples of how money was well spent on state-of-the-art equipment. When the worst had actually happened, however, the Idas had been betrayed. That's how Tenya saw what had happened at least. The obese director, once so confident and boastful, had made every excuse under the sun, but nothing changed the fact that his team of professionals, 2-1, had recused themselves from treating his brother. Oh, the men and women gave their own reasons as well. They weren't given enough warning. Tensai was in too delicate a state to be worked on, but it all amounted to the same denial in the end. Desperate, Tenya had watched as his mother had released the locks on her rarely seen temper, the normally calm woman tearing into the director and his staff for their deceitful behavior. She would have even sworn vengeance against the hospital itself, she knew, if the director hadn't broken down into a puddle of sweating fat and brayed out the name of the one doctor who could guarantee Tensai's survival. "Mdugshi, the Heaven Chancellor." "Greetings," came the soft words of an elderly man as he entered the waiting room. The doctor, as asserted by the white coat he wore, was a sight to see. He sported a balding head with only 2 long wisps of silver left on his crown, a protruding belly, held in check by an ancient-looking leather belt and the slacks it held up, and watery eyes that could in impolite company be called frog-like. For all of that, the man entered the room with a face that lacked any sign of true worry or concern. "You are Tensai Ida's family, correct?" "Dr. Gshi. How is Tensai?" Hang propriety. At that moment all Tenya wanted was to have his questions answered. It was with supreme effort that the youngest Ida was able to keep his voice to a low shout as he leapt to his feet. "Is my brother going to be all right?" The elderly doctor took a moment to examine the 2 Ida before him. a young boy visibly shuddering with a mix of anguish and rage who was trying to keep his voice down, and a still quietly sobbing mother. While it was not the first time the man, internationally known as the Heaven Canceller, had dealt with families going through a devastating experience, and they would be far from the last, the sight still hurt his old heart to see. He sighed. "Very well. Let me get right to it," Dr. G said, motioning for the pair to stay seated while he pulled up another seat for himself. After gently sitting himself down, he continued, his audience already giving him their full attention. "I'll be frank. Tensai Ida has suffered grievous trauma, to the degree that at this point in time the wounds are too severe to properly operate on. Chief among these injuries are the ones to his spine. His spinal cord was severed between the L3 and L4 vertebra, and the T7 and C7 vertebra have been crushed." At the grim diagnosis, the pair of Vida listening to the doctor's words paled. "That being said, Tensai Ida will survive." The dual sighs of relief, one loud and one shuddery, seemed to summon a blanket of peace over the hitherto tense waiting room. Unfortunately, the elderly doctor knew he had to push forward and rip that away before it settled for too long. There was still a harsh truth he needed to relate to the Ida family, one they needed to face sooner rather than later. "I won't sugarcoat this," Dr. G continued, moving forward. "Things will be quite difficult for Tensai Ida for the foreseeable future. We've already scheduled him for 10 surgeries already, and while I'm positive he'll be able to pull through each and every one, the chances of him making a full recovery are beyond what I can guarantee." The Heaven Canceller's words were level, measured with years of experience relating difficult news to distraught family members. His manner was stern, but in no way cruel. The gravity of the situation could be felt with each word, but so too was the doctor's unspoken promise that he would do everything he could to ensure his patient would return to his family eventually. "I am, however, afraid that at this point, retirement is unavoidable." In the face of what could have been, the dire verdict was accepted, even welcomed. At the very least, Tensai would live, even if Ingenium would not. Thank you, Doctor," Tanakuita said, using the last vestiges of her strength to pull herself together enough to speak with a clear voice. "Retirement might be unavoidable for my Tensai, but will he be able to lead a normal life?" Tenya would admit that his upbringing had led to him being less than adept at reading people, or the mood of a room, but even he could tell by the look on the Heaven Canceller's face there would be no good news for them. "I'm sorry, my lady, but the severity of Tensai's injuries have demanded certain sacrifices be made in order to safeguard his life even to this point," Dr. Gshi said, shaking his head sorrowfully. "I'm afraid that as it stands Tensai Ida will never walk again." The mother and son duo gasped at the declaration, Tanako's hands flying to cover her mouth while Tenya's clenched into fists. The young hero in training could feel his world, already on the brink, collapsing. He and his brother, his whole family, took great pride in their hereditary quirks and the mobility they were granted. Early retirement was bad enough, but to hear that his older brother was now crippled so severely, it was like being told evil had won not just the battle, but the war. Tenya didn't hear his mother lose the battle to contain her tears, nor did he hear the doctor continue to explain his brother's situation in greater detail. Instead, his mind turned inward, hoping to grasp the series of events that had led to this nightmarish outcome and come to some kind of understanding. If the director of his family's private hospital hadn't lied to them and his facility had actually met the promised standard, could Tensai have been saved from such severe consequences? Could his spine have been fixed before the damage it had suffered become permanent? If Team Iton hadn't used their standard operating procedure and split up during their patrol, could the backup have kept his brother safe? Why had the hero killer targeted Tensai in the first place? Was there really no other choice but to accept this atrocity? I understand this is hard, but I'm afraid Tensai Ida's injuries have progressed outside the realm of modern medicine's reach. Dr. Gshi's reaffirmation finally managed to drag Tenya's focus back to the present. We just don't have the knowledge or advancements of the pre-quirk awakening era anymore. However, a friend of mine is currently developing a type of exoskeleton that might be able to allow for some degree of mobility. Unfortunately, the progress is still in the early stages of development. I don't know when it would be a viable option for you. Mechanical aid? Hadn't Tenya heard of there being some sort of genius inventor lurking in the bowels of the UA support department? What about quirked aid? Tanako asked, desperate to grasp at any hope, any silver lining. There has to be someone with a healing quirk strong enough to help my tensei, right? A strong healing quirk. Dr. Chi was already shaking his head. Healing quirks by and large only accelerate the regenerative ability of a patient's own body, the elderly doctor said. While it's true that 1 in 100,000 healing quirks showcase abilities outside the norm, even they follow the limits of what's naturally feasible. For example, even Recovery Girl, who wields one of the strongest examples of a healing quirk in Japan's history, is powerless if her patient's wounds wouldn't naturally heal by themselves. The Heavens Chancellor sighed, rubbing his gnarled hands together as he momentarily glanced aside, conflict in his eyes. Shaking his head again, he continued. The only, and I mean the only, cases of quirks that heal outside the body's natural ability are those in the hands of the so-called regenerators, Dr. Chi said, looking between the two Iida before him. And I don't have to tell you that a regenerator's healing factor can't be transferred to another, do I? Regenerators. Healing? Midoriya. There is one WHO can. Tenya's outburst came as the youngest Iida leapt to his feet, his arms chopping the air frenetically. Both Tanako and the elderly doctor were startled by the sudden frenzy. What do you mean, Tenya? Tanako asked, baffled to the point she couldn't even process her son's words enough to feel a spark of hope at their meaning. I apologize, but what the hell are you going on about, young man? Dr. Chi, however, had no such trouble expressing his thoughts. He might have been getting on in years, but Mdochi wasn't a fool, nor ignorant of the goings-on of the world. He would have heard about a quirk strong enough to heal not just its wielder but others from the brink of death. Right? Instantly, Tenya tempered himself and sobered up. At the same time, he realized he just, as his less eloquent classmates might have said, forked up. Midoriya's quirk was meant to be kept a secret until the Verdanet was ready and willing to reveal it to the public. Well, the parts that the public hadn't already seen due to the news leak anyway. While his ability to survive just about anything and zombify the recently dead was widely known now, no one outside of UA knew he could heal the living just as easily. Disclosing such information would surely see him in the principal's office, if not expelled, but if that was the price he had to pay to save his brother's livelihood, so be it. One of my classmates has a quirk so potent that nothing short of complete annihilation would be able to stop him, Tenya explained, his deadly serious face conveying to his mother and the elderly doctor beyond a doubt he was speaking the truth. And even then, such a tactic's usefulness is questionable. The Heaven Chancellor took in the words of the young man before him, humming lowly as he closed his eyes, in thought. Of course, now that the young Iida had narrowed it down, the elderly doctor had an idea as to whom he was speaking of. It had to be the Midoriya boy, the champion of UA first-year sports festival. The boy that death itself seemed to refuse. But even so. You speak of young Midoriya, I presume? Dr. Chi asked, a clenching in his gut the only tell his body would give him that extinguishing hope still hurt him as much as it did when he was a younger man. As a medical professional, I have to tell you that mutant regenerators cannot. He can. Tenya interrupted, fire in his eyes akin to an awakened volcano. He used it earlier this year to save the life of a fellow classmate. My injuries weren't terrible, but hers were lethal. He not only stopped the bleeding, but he brought her back to completely perfect health. And that included repairing my classmate's damaged spine. Dr. Chi rubbed at his temples, feeling a headache coming on. He didn't need to look over to know that hope was beginning to glisten in Tanakoida's watery eyes. It all made sense now, he supposed. Nezu's silence. the lack of shared data regarding Chiyo's latest obsession. Professor Go's ultra-top-secret project conveniently located at UA, the drop-off of requests from said hero school for his expertise when Chiyo's quirk wasn't enough. What you are suggesting? Dr. Chi paused, remembering the oaths he'd sworn all those decades ago. Still requires the consent of the patient. And Midoriya, if I have anything to say about it. The elderly doctor had sworn himself to the protection, life and the health of his patients long ago. He'd pursue the goal of that oath regardless of the cost or effort involved. This had more than once necessitated breaking hospital regulations and dismissing naysayers from his presence mid-surgery. He'd even treated patients with methods outside what conventional knowledge would consider the norm. If Tensai Ida had gone under the knife of even the best surgeons in Japan, his chances of dying on the table would have been around 65% at best. Using his expertise and lack of regard for hospital regulations or his director's pocketbook, Dr. Chi knew he'd nearly nullified that percentage to zero. But he'd reached his limit. But what the Ida boy was offering? Tenya, I'll speak with Tensai, Tanaka said, suddenly standing as she slipped into the role of the next Ida matriarch. The woman was tired of sitting here like a useless lump, crying her eyes out. She'd been a hero once too for fork's sake. She wasn't going to lose either of her sons, or let them suffer, not if she could help it. Go and speak to your classmate. Now. We're going to help your brother get back on his feet. Tenya nodded, feeling his own fire being lit, in the wake of his mother's reignited passion. He knew what he needed to do. Aichi Prefecture, the Asui household. It had been 2 days since the first-year sports festival, since the day Japan's Hero Society had taken such a devastating blow. For one Baru Asui and her law firm, this would have normally meant a massive increase in workload, a golden opportunity to hunt down an extensive list of rather unscrupulous people in the ensuing upheaval. However, at that moment, the successful lawyer found herself participating in an activity that she rarely found the time to indulge in, one that her career always seemed to overshadow. Being a mother. Baru loved her family, and would fight anyone who said differently. And it wasn't like she preferred her casework over her family, but over the years events had construed themselves more often than not to force her into the office than her home. Sometimes being one of the most skilled and therefore feared lawyers in Japan had its downsides. There was always a case that required her full attention, always an innocent victim in need of justice, always new blood to train up to her high standards. In fact, if it wasn't for her understanding husband and helpful firstborn, Baru knew without a doubt she wouldn't be the force for good she was in their society. These last few days, they had been a brutal reminder of just how much she depended on those two. The ending of the first year's sports festival had opened not one, not two, but several cans of worms that would be causing tremors in Japan for months, if not years, to come. Might have been taking the brunt of the fallout for now, even being forced to submit to audits from practically every organization and group that had once backed them. But the collateral damage would inevitably spread to every other hero school in the country like a blight. Apparently, the public didn't support the idea of sending children to institutions that were unsafe. Who knew? It was bullshit. Hero schools literally taught their students how to put their lives on the line. They were inherently dangerous. Baru could understand where the people were coming from though, if not their priorities. She knew Hertsu had chosen a dangerous occupation when she expressed her desire to become a hero, and had accepted that. What she hadn't accepted was allowing shadowy puppet masters to put her eldest daughter's life in danger to feed their own biases and greed. Thankfully, a large number of parents of students present and past were also clamoring for more transparency, more involvement with the schools. The mismanagement showcased at the first year's sports festival had been put in the spotlight, and as such its days were hopefully numbered. Hero society and culture were both taking a hit as well, all thanks to the hacking during the awards ceremony. Decades of blind faith were suddenly coming into question. Report after report was being released broadcast every night on the questionable practices of pro-heroes and related government officials. The proverbial fortress that had always been the Hero Public Safety Commission was quickly revealed to be a sandcastle. All Might's immediate repudiation of the Hacking's video of his discussion with Endeavor and his explanation of the removed pieces had saved his image somewhat. Unfortunately, or fortunately depending on how you looked at it, the rest of the top 25 heroes of Japan had been put on the radar as a result. Before the unstoppable ferocity that was the public's outrage, the HPSC had bended the knee, and placed all of Japan's more famous heroes under probation. Each and every one was or would be going through a full investigation as if they'd already been caught committing a crime. As unpleasant as it might have seemed, many were publicly proclaiming it was long overdue for Japan's future prosperity. Then there was Endeavor. The number 2 hero had finally become number 1. At least, when it came as the symbol of everything that was wrong with quirkism and the quirk hierarchy in Japan. Much to Baru's chagrin, however, the bastard had managed the impossible. He'd not only brought the discrimination and despicable institution into the public eye, he'd also managed to polarize the country around the issues. Those who stood up against the quirk hierarchy demanded the disgraced hero purged from the national rankings and thrown into Tartarus. These people and organizations decried the hierarchy as an outdated and disproven artifact of the country's instability during the early years of the quirk era that needed to be excised from society for its own good. In response, those advocates in favor of the current system agreed that while Enji Todoroki had been far too forceful in his ideals, the fact he was the number 2 hero meant that those self-same ideals must have had some merit. Thankfully, these groups also agreed that the bastard should still be stripped of his rank and forced to serve some time in prison, though Baru was certain it was more for the fact Endeavor had been caught and had endangered their own comfortable positions and lifestyles than for any true altruistic reasons. Between it all, the HPSC, wanting to avoid the worst of the backlash from both sides, immediately suspended Endeavor's license and set his review to occur within the next few days. With the criminal charges Baru knew were already stacking against him, a trial would be inevitable after the bastard's assured demotion as well. And this time, Endeavor had precious little of the aegis he normally wielded against such occurrences. His team of lawyers had dwindled drastically, most abandoning the disgraced hero within the first hours after the end of the first year's sports festival. The defection had left Enji Todoroki with little in the way of legal advice or power. Baru lamented Endeavor's situation though. As it stood, there was no way for her to join the hunt, and subsequent butchery, of the bastard. This was one time she'd have to eat crow and abandon her pound of flesh. At least the root of her woes was worth it. The green-haired cinnamon roll currently sleeping on her couch, head cradled in her eldest's lap, was more than worth it. Any change, Inko-chan? Baru asked her fellow mother. The frog woman had intended to offer her protection to the Midoriya family from the start, even before the world had been upended into so much madness, as a repayment for all the young hero in training had done for her own family. Offering the mother and son pair a room in her own home was the least she could do, really. With everything that had happened and was currently happening, there was no way Baru could allow herself to let the Midoriya family face the world on their own. The media, the vultures, was no doubt already on the hunt for them even before the awards ceremony debacle. In fact, the only reason Ganma had been able to retrieve some, Izuku, and the undead trio without much trouble had been thanks to the machinations of Nezu combined with All Might taking the brunt of the reporter's attentions. His temperature has finally fallen within the range of normalcy, Inko replied, taking another look at the thermometer in her hand. The rejuvenated mother barely managed to resist the urge to caress her son's sweat-dampened hair, allowing his wonderful girlfriend to continue carding a hand through it instead. And he's still sleeping peacefully, so there's that. When Ganma had first returned to the house with the UA group, Izuku had been so weak he'd only just managed the journey thanks to Tai carrying him. His temperature had been in the triple digits and he'd either been unconscious or incoherent. It had been the worst state any of those gathered had ever seen the Verdanet. What had been truly frightening was that even by the time Tay had laid Izuku down onto the couch when they returned, his heart still hadn't fully regenerated. For a long while the battered hero in training could only wake up, ask for food, eat what was given to him, and then pass out again in an endless cycle. Inko, Baru, and Tsu had all separately resigned themselves to waiting until Izuku had fully recovered before reprimanding them, instead focusing on obtaining the most caloric food they could in order to aid in his regeneration. The night the Verdana devoured 3 extra large pieces, by himself in under 10 minutes, would stay in the woman's minds for years to come. Especially how he fell asleep right after, slumbering peacefully as if he hadn't just eaten an inhuman amount in one sitting. His heart beating normally again too. Tsu reported, continuing to brush her fingers through her Izuku's hair with one hand while the other remained on his chest. She really wanted her boyfriend to wake up soon. She had so much scolding to do. Outside, in the Asui's walled-in backyard, the sounds of children playing tag faintly trickled into the more somber air of the house. Lily had quickly proven herself a master at entertaining the youngest of the Asui family. The little tadpoles Samadare and Satsuki absolutely loving having someone their age to play with who had more energy than they did. For the first time since arriving back home, Ganma was absent. The husband and father of 3 had taken the family car to the mechanics that morning, the normally relaxed man uncharacteristically incensed when Saki had informed him that she could tell his coveted SUV had a faulty engine just by listening to it, and that it had most likely been sabotaged by the mechanics themselves during the last maintenance check so that he'd have to return sooner rather than later for expensive repairs. The undead delinquent had been more than happy to accompany the Toad Man on his righteous quest, eager to teach some sheetheads that the profession of mechanic was not one that would be tainted by misguided greed while she had anything to say about it. Ugh. Suddenly, Izuku groaned, clumsily floundering to sit up before quickly acquiescing to the gentle pressure of Tsu pushing him to lay back down. The Verdana cracked his eyes open, shutting them immediately at the brightness of the world around him. Morning, Izuku grumbled. The greeting was met with warm smiles and looks of relief. Frustratingly, cursed blood had seemed to be quite selective when it came to how it worked on certain injuries, and the 2 families were still learning the quirks. Sometimes, it seemed Izuku would remain fully conscious during the regeneration process, forced to feel every second of agony as the wounds he'd accrued were healed. Other times, it seemed even, the quirk itself knew that the pain would be too much for the Verdana to handle, and he'd be locked in a comatose state, completely unreachable until sufficiently healed. It was little comfort to know that losing his heart met the criteria of complete coma recovery in Cursed Blood's book. Tsu-chan. Izuku trailed off, instead basking in the feeling of utter bliss he was just coming to realize he could feel. His head was resting on something utterly soft and comfortable. Opening his eyes again, he tried to turn his head to see what it was, instantly blushing as he realized his incredible pillow was his girlfriend's lovely thighs. Snapping his head back forward, Izuku locked eyes with Tsu's own. The look of love in those eyes almost stole his breath away. Then, Tsu's face shifted, suddenly full of anger. Before Izuku could ask what was wrong, his girlfriend's hands were pinching and pulling at his freckled cheeks. Hard. Why do you have to scare me like that? Tsu whispered so lowly the words almost came out as a hiss, no hint of her habitual croak in sight. Why did you decide to showboat when Lily was more than capable of taking down Todoroki in seconds? What followed was a fruitless effort by Izuku to explain himself to his girlfriend without the benefit of speech, the young woman refusing to loosen her grip on his cheeks even a little. While this lovers' quarrel continued, a relieved Inko and Baru left for the kitchen to make themselves and the rest of their family members tea and coffee. The 2 mothers decided, with a silent conversation of raised eyebrows and head tilts, to allow the young couple to work out this issue themselves. They were patient. They could wait their turn to reprimand the reckless boy on the couch in due time. To the side of the couch, opposite the door to the backyard, Tae stood as she always had since Izuku had fallen into his recuperative slumber on the couch, a stone sentinel perpetually guarding its priceless treasure. During the previous days, it hadn't mattered who'd tried to interact with the eldest zombie girl, be it either of the mothers or Tsu, or even Samadera and Satsuki climbing all over her for fun. She hadn't moved or responded at all. Having grown used to the Ravnet's apparent state of inactiveness, none noticed when Tae's features softened, a small smile growing as she watched over Tsu continue to scold her master. Even if the words were hard, she could tell they sprang from a place of love, and it was wonderful to know her master now had a loving, lovely family of his own. Hours later, at the local drive-in Torai, once Ganma and Saki had arrived back home, both sporting conspiratorial smirks that were far too smug to be legal. The trio of adults had proposed a celebration. Buru, noticing the rather evil grin on her husband's face, had decided that for once she'd just go with the flow and take the time she had to relax instead of getting involved. She had also decided to ask after the fate of the mechanics later that night during a private moment with her man. "Is it really okay for me to order this much?" Izuku asked bashfully, looking over the menu packed full of bowls, dishes, and plates of every kind. He might have been starving, but he still had the decency to ask for confirmation before ordering. "I'm really hungry and you know I'm not a small eater." Izuku being hungry was nothing new. His bottomless hunger after a truly debilitating injury like the one he just survived had been expected by the adults after it had taken 2 days and everything in the Asui family's pantry to get him back on his feet. Luckily for the wallets of all involved, the owner of the family restaurant had taken one look at the group, specifically the Verdane pair at the center, and had subtly communicated to Buru and Inko that they wouldn't be charged a single yen for their meal that day. When the two mothers had begged for a moment to go to the restroom to powder their noses after the families had seated themselves, and had instead cornered the owner to see what the motives were behind his charity, they'd been relieved to find there was nothing shady in the works. According to the old man, his offer came due to a multitude of reasons. First, it was a gift as an apology for treating Tae as dangerous the first time Izuku had visited. Secondly, word of his establishment serving food to the champion of UA first-year sports festival would doubtlessly spread, promoting his business higher than any commercial could. Lastly, the owner admitted that he sought to build another restaurant at Dagoba Beach. Saki, who'd followed the mothers for their own protection, had nearly jumped at the mere mention of the proposal, but had held herself back at the last second. Any decisions involving Dagoba were Izuku's call, not hers. "Just eat, Karo," Buru replied, smiling at her future son-in-law. "Don't worry yourself with anything besides recovering for right now, alright?" Tsu nodded at her mother's wise words. She'd been worried sick over her Izuku for what felt like forever. It had hurt keeping what she'd seen in that tunnel a secret. Even now, her boyfriend wasn't completely okay. He needed more time to rest, more food to fully repair all the damage he'd suffered. When she checked before they'd left the house, his heartbeat was still weaker than it should have been, and the slight wheeze she could hear every time he breathed gave away the fact that his lung wasn't functioning at full capacity either. Needless to say, the enhanced muscles he'd produced during the tournament had all been eaten away as well. "Eat until you can't eat anymore," Tsu said, nearly ordering her boyfriend as she poked his cheek to get her point across. "I'll hand feed you if I have to, Karo." Speechless, Izuku could do nothing but feel blessed. Sitting between his girlfriend and his oldest and most steadfast partner, he could almost feel the love and acceptance radiating from the pair. Across from him, the two mothers of their little group were giving him gentle smiles, boosting the feelings of affection and safety he felt. Sitting at the next table over, his girlfriend's father showed off impressive skills that kept Satsuki, Samadera, and Lily entertained while he cooked their food. Even Saki was actually having a civil conversation with the owner of the restaurant. This was the life. It was perfect. It was heaven. Nothing could. VRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRR The sudden noise of a high-speed engine passing the restaurant, the screeching of something metal and rubber skidding to a stop, and then the engine coming back only to slam into something caused the two family group to look out the window beside them. There, a certain bespectacled teen was plastered against the glass panes wearing a visage so intense it came off as frightening. The people inside the restaurant could only stare at this unexpected appearance. The newcomer fixed Izuku with his sharp eyes for less than 2 seconds before he blinked once before darting toward the entrance of the establishment. The doors soon burst open to the point their hinges creaked, and the teen rushed in like a missile, heading straight toward Izuku. Midoriya. This was the only thing Tenya Ida roared with all his strength as he made a beeline toward his classmate. Confusion struck through the shock first, then panic. The distance between the two might have been small, but those watching the scene felt like they were watching an avalanche approach its unsuspecting victims in slow motion. Before any of the living could react, Tei and Saki were already in motion. Thud. UGH. The instant Tei had the youngest Ida within reach, she tackled him to the ground with enough force to drive all the air from not only his lungs but the engines in his legs. Not a second later, Saki reached down and applied a full Boston Crab hold on the downed and winded speedster. Who the fork do you think you are to interrupt the boss meal and then attack him? The blonde delinquent barked, putting pressure on Ida's back and legs. You worthless piece of shit. At his seat, Izuku could do no more than blink in utter confusion at the scene. Midoriya GH. Wait. Ida cried, struggling to reach his target. The speedster did his best to ignore the pain, but it was a lot of pain. Please. You must help. Izuku nearly perked up at the plea, always willing to listen to a cry for help, but before he could even stand Tei leaned down and smashed her sister's captive into the ground. Humph. Izuku moved to intervene, but Tsu, expecting this, shoved a helping of curry udon into his mouth. The suddenness gave the Verdane a pause before his stomach growled loudly. Whatever his classmate needed, surely it could wait a little bit. Roughly 30 minutes later, after 20 minutes of suffering in absolute silence while his green-haired classmate demolished enough food to support a dozen obese adults, Tenya Ida hadn't been able to tolerate the looks from Midoriya's supporters any longer. Once he'd been given permission to speak and released from the hold the blonde zombie had him in, and ignored the smaller children calling him scary for the umpteenth time, he'd gone into a 10-minute-long recounting of what had happened to his older brother and what fate awaited him if Midoriya refused to help. After that, he'd tearfully made his request. "Oh, is that all?" Izuku asked, biting into a thick slab of jukitsu, hardly looking away from the table. The youngest Ida swallowed his immediately boiling rage at such a blasé response. The nonchalance of his classmate toward saving his brother was infuriating, but he knew getting angry wouldn't help him now. If only his family were as close to the Midoriyas as the Asui had become. At this moment, Tenya Ida truly regretted not taking the time to really get to know his classmate with the dark quirk. Midoriya-san. Ida tried again, burying his anger, guilt, and despair as much as he could. "I beg of you. Please." With that, the youngest Ida threw himself into a full doujutsu. His own pride meant nothing compared to his brother's life. He would gladly give his own legs if it had meant allowing Tensai to walk again. Izuku grumbled at the sight, uncomfortable with his classmate's display. He just didn't get it. From a medical standpoint, he understood of course. Ingenium had been crippled by the hero killer, and the doctors had no way of healing him to the point he'd be able to use his legs again. But Ida was making a typhoon over split water. There was no need for all of this running and screaming. Ingenium wasn't in immediate danger. Hell, from the sounds of it, his surgeries were scheduled to start a month from now, so it didn't sound like he was in any danger of dying overnight. Honestly, Ida could have just approached him at any other more convenient time and place. "I can help, but..." Izuku trailed off, unsure how to piece together his thoughts into words that would get his point across. There was a lot to consider, This wasn't like when he'd healed Tsu during the battle trial incident or raised any of the girls. Was the head doctor of the hospital Ingenium was staying at okay with his participation? Was the pro-hero aware of the implications of being healed by his quirk? Was Ida himself aware of what would happen to his brother after cursed blood was introduced into his body? Because really, he'd only succeeded in stemming his quirk's control aspect once so far, and that was when his own mother was the subject. Who knew if cursed blood would listen to such a demand when injected into a complete stranger? Not to sound like a materialist, but what is Izuku getting out of this? Tsu asked into the silence at the same time as she stuffed a chicken roll into her boyfriend's mouth. It might be quirk-based, but you're not asking for a minor injury or common illness to be fixed here. That immediately struck a nerve with Izuku. Mostly because he'd never be so shallow as to demand payment for helping someone. On top of that, contrary to popular belief, cursed blood didn't seem to differentiate between a shallow paper cut and a pulverized spine. However, for good or for ill, every time he opened his mouth, Tsu had another piece of food ready to shove into his gullet. My daughter is being blunt, but not wrong, Baru said, joining the discussion for the first time. It hadn't escaped the frog woman's notice that her future son-in-law looked ready to head to the hospital at that very moment before her eldest had spoken. This doesn't sound like an emergency, young Ida. Your brother is stable and in no need for immediate assistance. For all intents and purposes, Ingenium's care falls under the purview of doctors now, not heroes. There would be serious backlash if we acted on impulse now without further planning and discussion. But Ida was reeling from what he could tell was a thinly veiled refusal. Indeed, all those months avoiding Midoriya and his group were coming back to haunt him now. Harshly, my son went through hell during the sports festival. He can't even go outside right now without assigned police escorts because reporters keep hounding him for interviews and sound bites they can use for quirks knows what. Inko added, throwing in her own thoughts. The youthful-looking mother was against anything that could potentially garner her baby any more exposure than he was already suffering. He's still recovering from his last match, and you come here asking him to bleed for your brother. The blow might have been low, but the youngest Ida knew he rightfully deserved it for his brash actions. Who didn't know Midoriya's situation with the media right now? It seemed like almost every local outlet had taken the events of the sports festival and run their own way with them, twisting them to fit any narrative they could think of. His achievements, his conquests on the path to heroics, all of it had been warped in the worst possible ways. Tenya steeled himself. There was one thing he, or rather, his family, could do. I will swear the Ida family's aid in turning the tide against the rabble that desires to smear your name, Midoriya. Our rankings might not be habitually too high, our reach is much more impressive. And I'll pay for your meal today. And then the day you help my brother. Izuku sighed. This was getting a bit much for him. I could go today, but that's not the problem, the Verdanet said, finally blocking Tsu's chopsticks with his own. He raised a brow at his pouting girlfriend before turning back to his still bowing classmate. You do understand what it means to be healed by my quirk, right? Does your brother? That made Tenya think. When he'd first described Midoriya's quirk to his brother, Tensai had commented on how frightening the idea of being dominated by an outside force was. At the time, Tenya had agreed wholeheartedly, which he knew made his pleas now all the more hypocritical. Of course, Tensai had also said Midoriya didn't sound like the sort of person to use the side effect of his quirk for nefarious purposes either. My mother is speaking to Tensai now. Hopefully, she'll have his official consent soon. Tenya answered, sticking with the truth as he knew it. There was no point in giving false assurances. Why don't we talk about this again once that's been resolved? Izuku proposed, all gathered blinking at his consideration. Take your time to explain the whole picture to your brother. Make sure he really does want this. The principal's cancellations are still in effect, so we'll be returning to class in 5 days. That'll be plenty of time for you to get everything settled and let Me know what the final word is. Tenya wanted to argue, to drag his classmate to the hospital and have his brother healed right there and then. But this was much better than a refusal. And it was all he was going to get. I understand, Midoriya-san, Tenya said, standing so he could bow from the waist. I apologize for interrupting your meal with your family. Tilting his head down, the youngest Ida hid his tears behind the glare of the light upon his glasses. So then, the owner of the restaurant poked his head out of the kitchen area. Is the young master staying for lunch then? Serving the UA champion and the illustrious Asui family had been great enough advertisement. The pictures he'd managed to take of the two families while they ate would make for a great investment that would pay for the loss of all the food today 1,000 times over. If he could add the Ida family to that, all the better. No thank you, Tenya answered curtly, though he still took out his credit card. However, I will be paying for their meal. Please keep serving them until they are finished. The older man instinctively went to refuse the payment, as he'd already written off the day as a loss, when he caught the Asui matriarch giving him a subtle nod. Sighing, the owner guided the foolish boy toward the register. Far be it for one such as him to get involved with heroic politics. At least he'd still get massive publicity from those pictures. He'd just have to give some free meals away tomorrow, to assuage his guilt for fleecing this youngster. Meanwhile, Baru watched the retreating teen with a faint grin on her face. That was one problem temporarily averted. But the troubles couldn't be avoided forever. The frog woman knew her future son-in-law's path would continue to grow thornier and thornier as he progressed into heroics. It was only a matter of time, and doing what she could to ease the way. Aldra Middle School had recently closed, a long overdue development. The fools calling themselves the administration had publicly protested Izuku's victory, claiming to any who'd listened that their star student, a certain explosive blonde, would have been on the podium that day if not for the upstart mutant they'd been forced to suffer. Such a brazen declaration couldn't go unrewarded, and so the proper authorities had been prodded to investigate such claims. That had naturally led to unwanted attention being drawn to issues the school's administration and staff had worked to keep under wraps. From what Baru had heard, Bakugo's situation had been brought to light within an hour, which in turn kicked off the snowball effect that ended up revealing all of the bullying, file tampering, and lies that had riddled Aldra for years. From there, connections to maladjusted alumni of the school that had been involved in crimes of all levels were a foregone conclusion. For once, the viciousness of the local reporters was working in their favor. The media was doing a fantastic job of demonizing every professional that had ever worked at Aldra for the last 3 decades. With Aldra's fate sealed, and its staff facing both criminal charges and countless lawsuits, the public had taken less than a day to decide what the next social issue to focus on would be. Within 24 hours, every other educational institution with even a single spot on its record was under the microscope. It was a can of worms that Baru enjoyed watching squirm from her own place, out of the way and safely in her office or at home with her family. She hardly needed to get involved after all. The fools were doing an excellent job of self-destructing on their own. Unfortunately, for all that, Izuku and her eldest were still in the spotlight. Their little love declaration, while lovely, had and was causing quite the uproar. Both quirkists and their opponents were critical of their relationship. Her daughter's speech was still resounding in the internet forums, giving her a notoriety the mother was greatly worried about, and Izuku's victory still caused waves without even being mentioned. The two together seemed to cause some people's heads to explode. Worse yet was what they called him. The Immortal. That wasn't good. It wasn't good at all. Hey boss. Saki suddenly strode over, a wide grin on her face. The owner said all 4 eyes paid enough to open a new restaurant at the beach. Sounds like the gang can even manage it all by themselves. Please say yes. Baru couldn't help the low chuckle that escaped her iron self-control. It seemed the troubles would keep piling up, one way or another. UA main campus, principal's office, 1 week later. After much turmoil, Classes had finally resumed at the Hero Academy, much to the growing stress of the staff. The fallout of the sports festival kept growing with no sign of stopping any time soon. By all indications, things were actually going to continue to decline. Aldry Middle School closing had soon been followed by 3 other widely known middle schools closing their doors. The scrutiny on all of the hero schools in Japan that had accepted students from any of the 4 former institutions had intensified as a result. To make an already delicate situation hairier, UA board had been surrendered to the authorities, which had of course been leaked to the press. Regardless, it was long overdue. Their blatant rigging of the sports festival, manipulation of academy finances, and glaring discrimination against certain students couldn't be ignored any longer. Nezu, hyper-intelligent firing on all cylinders, had managed to talk his way into being labeled a victim of the board as well, though not one above some level of reproach. The quirked animal accepted that he should have been paying more attention to the details of the school he was in charge of, but had made sound arguments for that being the reason there had been a board in the first place, to help the principal carry the load. Needless to say, he'd repeatedly stated how much he regretted growing lax and promised he'd put his entire being into pulling UA back to its illustrious heights. Part and parcel with that oath, to regain some of the public trust lost, Nezu had gone on to announce that UA would no longer accept the money of any investor that attempted to have a hand in the school's operations, and all future investors would be heavily vetted. The tactic worked, and the public's view of the hero school noticeably improved. So too was the drop in UA budget as sponsors disappeared seemingly overnight. "It's fortunate that we had that little accident," Nezu muttered while sitting in his now nearly barren office. He gave a small chuckle that only slightly alleviated some of his stress. A happy little accident indeed. The accident in question was of course first-year Mai Hatsume showcasing a number of inventions at her fair stand that had been marked prohibited for sale. The creations had gotten the attention of the JSDF, however, and had resulted in a steady income for the Academy for the time being. It was a fraction of the old budget, but it was better than nothing. Many of the old luxuries would need to continue to be sacrificed, but other than the USJ seeing a painful reduction in resources, it wasn't anything he couldn't manage. Maybe this is all for the best. Nezu pondered to himself as he took a sip from his personal mug of coffee. It was too bad he wouldn't be able to get that special blend he'd come to enjoy. Having a more hands-on approach is something I'd been wanting from the beginning. Yes, it was good that the members of the board were gone now. Siding with all for one, however unwittingly in some cases, was a sure way to garner a ticket to one prison or another, at best. And if any of the idiots managed to avoid their due sentences, well, he knew dozens of rightfully angry parents who were just waiting for their own chances to mete out some justice. Now, to tackle our newest problems. One at a time. The quirked animal sighed, looking over at the 2 large stacks of paperwork that would have taller than he was if he'd stood on his desk if they'd been combined. By virtue of his quirk, and helping his assistant organize the stacks earlier that morning, Nezu knew that the top document on the right stack was a facture bearing the Asui family seal. He'd known that the aid of such a woman as Baru Asui wouldn't come cheap, but even still the receipt made him shudder. Professional grade indeed. Still, she'd been instrumental in pulling UA out of the muck this time. So, UA main campus, 1A classroom. Izuku was happy to have finally returned to the classroom. He loved his mother, and his new extended family, don't get him wrong, but the adults could be suffocating with their concern at times. The day marking their return to semi-normalcy had begun as strangely as it had been refreshing. After Ganma had dropped them off at the border of the eye barrier, he, Su, and his partners had entered with no opposition at all. The third-year teacher that had been standing at the entry gates hadn't even given them a second glance. Then the strangeness had really started. After walking into the large foyer of UA main building, Ndo Monoma of all people had approached the group and apologized. He'd even offered to shake hands, with gloves on. The entire time, the blonde member of Class 1B hadn't made a single snide or condescending comment. Shortly after, Ida had approached them, offering to carry his backpack. It had been an obvious attempt at gaining his trust, but a simple assurance that he'd be helping Ingenium as long as the pro agreed with his help had been enough to get the speedster to act more normally. Although, he had still headed back to their homeroom while crying. Had that been due to happiness or sadness? When he and his group had finally gotten to 1A's homeroom, it had almost been like a repeat of the first day, everyone lost in their own little worlds. There were noticeable changes, however. Most glaring was that there were now 3 empty seats in the room. As Izuku stared at the now vacant seat once belonging to one Shoto Todoroki, Kyauka and Fumikage came and greeted the group as they entered, offering congratulations on the recent engagement. That had seemed to embolden many of their classmates to ask questions, some of which were quite intimate, and still being asked now. So, honestly guys, who top, take your seats. Now. Aizawa-sensei's growl cut off the noise better than an executioner's blade as the underground hero entered the room. Within the span of 1 second to the next, everyone was in their seats before the scruffy man could reach his desk. As it should be. Despite having been in the sights of the media first among all of UA staff for Class 1A's previous misadventures, after the sports festival hack, Aizawa had actually come out of the debacle with less flack than any of the others. Now, instead of castigating him, the hypocrites were praising his hardliner stance regarding the expulsions of 2 former students. The notoriety was already annoying him. Now that you've all had your first taste of public exposure, and witnessed how quickly things can go to shit, it's time you take the next step in your heroic development, Aizawa drawled, his dry delivery doing nothing to keep his students from hearing how their teacher felt about public exposure. Today, you'll be making an important decision that will follow you for the rest of your careers. You'll be choosing your hero names. The classroom immediately exploded with cheers. None could hide their excitement at finally reaching such a long-awaited milestone. Well, almost none. Izuku had absolutely no idea what he was going to do. Quiet, Aizawa said in complete monotone, activating his quirk with a glare. The room fell silent once more. This isn't something to go at half-cocked. These code names will be integral. As his homeroom teacher continued on, Izuku fell into an internal struggle, blocking out the rest of the words. Heroes took names that meant something. They either went with something that reflected their quirks, or their style. All Might had famously stated he'd chosen his name because he wanted to be the one who was mighty enough to take on any and all challenges. Eraserhead, while simpler, still gave a nod to the underground hero's quirk. So, what kind of name fit him? Izuku Midoriya, wielder of a quirk like cursed blood. What word, what phrase, could speak for him, his power, or his ideals? That's right. The sudden shout snapped Izuku from his inner turmoil just as Midnight threw open the door to the classroom. The voluptuous Ravnette sashayed to the front in her usual, flamboyant self, Aizawa's lack of reaction indicating this wasn't an unscripted intrusion. That's why I'm here to help all you good little boys and girls make the right choices, Midnight announced cheerfully. We can't in good conscience let you pick anything. Naughty. Now could we? It kind of made sense, in a way. For all his constant fatigue and facade of disinterest, Aizawa had proven himself to be a great teacher. That being said, the man was not cut out for certain activities. Midnight, on the other hand, had jumped at the chance to help guide a new generation of heroes in this most important endeavor and aid them in getting their creative juices flowing. Oh wait. We can't start without these two, the R-rated heroine said, as if just remembering something important. She signaled to the still open door with a wave, "Come on in you two. Don't be shy." Into the room walked 2 students, and 1A gasped as one. The first student, purple hair still as wild as ever, stared back at them all with a tired expression so familiar many nearly cricked their necks looking between him and their homeroom teacher. Yo. Name's Hitoshi Shinso, the exhausted-looking newcomer greeted. Curiously, the lazy wave he gave in response to the gasp seemed to be directed solely at Izuku. "I'll be part of the hero course from now on. Please take care of me." The lack of reaction of Shinso's new classmates in return could be forgiven this once due to who'd walked in with him. The sight alone had most likely been the cause of their gasps of shock. Shoto Todoroki stood, bashfully looking away from his classmates. The looks of incredulity weren't unexpected, but the dual-haired boy still found the mutterings that followed uncomfortable. Wasn't he expelled? What's he doing here? Fork, are those cuffs quirk suppressants? Aizawa let the teens under his care have a minute to gawk and get over their shock before deciding enough was enough. Officially, Shoto Todoroki is no longer part of Class 1A, the underground, Hiro began, his glare enough to prevent any response or potential riot from happening. However, as part of his mandatory therapy, he'll be attending classes 3 days a week so that he may benefit from positive social interactions in an effort to reintegrate him into society. Taking a closer look at their heterochromatic ex-classmate, many could see signs of the guilt weighing the teen down. While sympathetic after the truth regarding Endeavor had come out, there was still some visible hesitance from some of the students. If Todoroki is cleared by a successive list of therapists, he might be eligible to return to the course fully, Aizawa continued. That being said, we don't expect anyone to give him special treatment. With that, Shinso and Todoroki were waved off. Todoroki took his empty seat back, and Shinso took what had once been Bakugo's chair. Once the two were seated, Midnight fully took over for Aizawa and launched into her introduction into hero naming. UA main campus, 1A classroom, 6 minutes later. It hadn't taken long for the class to get derailed. Alien Queen. Mina cheered with pure delight as she flipped over the small whiteboard in her hands to show the class. The potential hero name was drawn with wild strokes, a small alien head with what looked like a second head for a tongue underneath. Denied. Midnight shouted, arms crossed in front of her in an X formation. Do you want to face lawsuits every time someone says your name? The rhetorical question was more than enough to send the extraterrestrial-looking teen back to the drawing board. Unfazed by the slowly degrading chaos around him, Izuku continued to slide further and further back into his inner dialogue. No matter how he wished it were otherwise, his quirk was classified, however unofficially, as dark. There was no two ways about it. It wouldn't really bother him too much, since he knew dark didn't necessarily mean evil, but the public's view of such things was an entirely different beast. Heroes with questionable names existed, such as Vlad King, and so too did heroes with what many considered villainous appearances, like Gang Orca, but each and every one could tell you if asked that they continued to fight an uphill battle to be properly recognized by the public for their deeds instead of their quirks or looks. Izuku shuddered, Romero flashing through his psyche. There was no way he'd be using that for a hero name. I already had this name in mind since I was little. I think it'll be popular with children, Sa said, his girlfriend's calm words enough to temporarily pull Izuku back to the land of the living. The frog girl turned her whiteboard over. I'm going to be the rainy season hero, Fry. Midnight squealed, legitimately squealed. The R-rated heroine hugged herself, squirming in place as many in Class 1A cheered for such a well-thought-out and cutesy name. That's adorable. Midnight said, finally able to speak, approved. Izuku loved his girlfriend, but at the moment he felt extremely envious all the same. There was no hope for him, a cute hero name was an impossibility. Jiro, who'd been whispering something to Dark Shadow, while everyone had been cheering, patted the quirk entity on the beak affectionately before standing from her seat. As the punk rocker walked to the front of the classroom, the living shadow returned to its other half, snickering as it whispered into Fumikage's ear. Reaching the front of the room, Kyoka turned, a small smile on her face. The sound hero, the punk rocker announced, Jax. Midnight nodded her head, clear approval in her gaze. Now that's a good one. The R-rated heroine said, smiling at another successful name chosen. It calls back to your quirk without giving away what you can do. Bowing slightly to their temporary teacher, Kyoka returned to her seat. Sighing, Fumikage stood up next, thankful no one but his queen could tell he was blushing through his dark feathers. The avian teen wanted to get this over with. And it wasn't like he hadn't had this name decided already long before now. Sliding the whiteboard onto Aizawa-sensei's desk, he stared forebodingly out at his classmates as he made his decree. "Jet Black Hero," Fumikage said, "Tsukuyomi." The look that came upon Midnight's face was, well, it definitely earned the heroine her R rating. Ah! God of the Night. The aptly named R-rated heroine moaned, enjoying the blushes that she could see blooming across the classroom at her behavior. If only the poor innocent dears knew what was coming in their second-year hero classes. Anti-seduction training was one of her favorites. So mysterious. Mysterious. Izuku liked that idea. His close friend had taken a name related to not only their country's mythology, but the mythological origins of his own power. If he wanted to do the same, perhaps he'd have to think more of how to incorporate his blood into his name. It was a start at least. In his head once more, Izuku only realized time had passed when Momo stepped up to the front of the room. "I shall be the everything hero," Momo declared, calmly with a smile. "Creati." "Oh!" Midnight cheered, easily agreeing with the choice. "Creative. Descriptive and elegant too." Descriptive. Izuku knew he needed to find a way to describe his quirk in a way that the public would be able to understand without any questions or miscommunications. Since his powers all stemmed from his blood, it was almost a no-brainer to include it. Unfortunately, doing so while making his hero name elegant wouldn't be so easy. "Pinky!" Mina shouted, causing Izuku to almost fall out of his chair due to his inattention. The frustrated acid user stood there, waiting for Class 1A's temporary teacher to speak. "Well, it does the job," Midnight conceded, much to her students' chagrin. "It's simple, but I know you can make it work, girl." Simple yet descriptive. Easy to understand yet thematic. Staring down at his whiteboard, Izuku began to ignore potential words that wouldn't fit these two ideals until only two remained. "Not bad at all, boss," Saki murmured, leaning over Izuku's shoulder to peek at what he'd written. "Lily doesn't think it's cute, but it does ring true for Unyai-chan." Lily chimed in, her head just poking out from behind the blonde's side. "You goo." Tei's response all but confirmed the matter for Izuku. Smiling at his accomplishment, Izuku turned to look at his three partners. It wouldn't be fair if he was the only one with a name now, would it? "How about you three?" the Verdainet asked, motioning to the whiteboard. There was room on the slab under his future name for three more. Saki gave him a savage grin, a completely opposite reaction to the resigned smile from Lily. "All right then. Let's go." "Oh, you have yours now, Midoriya?" Midnight asked, seeing Verdainet was the last one in the class who hadn't announced their hero name yet. Izuku nodded confidently back, taking his place at the front of the classroom. His partners quickly flanked him, each standing at ease. "There's no getting around it, my quirk is considered dark by most of our society," Izuku intoned, instantly catching the full attention of the entire room. "So, instead of hiding it, or sugarcoating it, I decided to embrace it. I will let who I am be plain for all to see. That's why I'm choosing this name." Izuku placed the whiteboard on the desk for the entire world to see. And it read simply, "The Sinister Hero, Bloodborne the Grave Walkers, Ghoul, Banshee, and Wraith." There was silence, and it was deafening. Izuku could tell many of his classmates were stuck between asking him if he was sure of his choice and praising him for his boldness. In truth, he didn't feel like he needed either. Being accepted by the world is going to be an uphill battle. "I know this," Izuku said, giving a smile of sunshine that had no business showing itself in such a moment. "But it'll be no different than traversing the deepest, darkest of nights. Because no matter how long the night is, the dawn will come. The dawn will come." Those closest to the Verdainet shuddered, swearing they heard 4 different voices speaking as one at that repeated phrase. Before any in Class 1A could think too long on their classmate's unveiling, Izuku's smile turned somber. The dawn will come. No matter how much it burns those who oppose it. Only 3 in the classroom, with heartbeats at least, could say they had any idea of the true meaning of those last words so softly murmured. For the rest, the ominous words would be soon forgotten in the hustle and bustle of life as heroes in training, only to return to prominence much later in their lives as pro-heroes. Magnus. Next chapter will start the hero killer arc, which means that one of the confrontations you've all been expecting is getting closer. Omake, in dire need. Deep within UA inside the now much more barren principal's office, 2 first-year students were standing before the quirked animal himself. Both were scared out of their minds, and with good reason. Mai Hatsume would have normally been able to blow off any interaction between herself and a member of the staff. They usually just wanted to take a break from the support studio. Anyone who got between her and baby making wasn't worth taking the time to listen to after all. But this was Nezu, and even Mai knew who held the ultimate power at UA. The mad genius could guess why she was here though. It wasn't hard. She'd participated in the first-year sports festival in a much greater capacity than anyone would have expected, and maybe preferred. First, she'd competed in each of the 3 events, and at least the third was normally reserved for actual hero course students or those aiming to join the course midterm. And then she'd opened her own stand at the support fair. Honestly, Mai hadn't held out any hopes for finding success at the fair. Right now she was a nobody inventor, a student even, so who would look twice at her babies right now? Therefore, her initial plan had been to ditch the assigned stand in favor of showcasing her babies to the public herself after exiting the 3rd event. Thanks to Kado, she'd been able to kick that plan out the window and have her partner keep the stand open while she competed. That had been her downfall. To be fair, Kid wasn't an idiot. In fact, Mai would even admit the brunette was nothing short of a genius. In her own fields. Otherwise, she was prone to freaking out and forgetting any useful information that wasn't related to her friends or her area of expertise. She was even clumsy when not typing at a computer. And all of that had combined in the worst way possible at the fair. Ms. Hatsume, Ms. Hanjo, Nezu finally said, causing both young women to freeze where they stood. A moment ago I received a call from a General Hazama. I'm certain you know why? Mai refused to blink, even though she could feel her heart threatening to crawl out of her throat. She hadn't meant to sell any of her and Ichi's babies. Really. They were some of the only babies she had that she held as sacrosanct, her first proof that someone could actually understand her and care about support gear invention as much as she did. There's no way she'd risk alienating her Ichi for something as mundane as cash or fame. But in the heat of the moment, finally being showered with praise and having so many people showering her babies with love, she lost control of herself. She'd succumbed to temptation and made promises she'd had no right to make on her own. While her pink-haired friend continued to do her best to keep herself in one piece, Tanjo wallowed in guilt beside her. This was all her fault. If only she hadn't been so lazy and learned English, maybe then she would have been able to recognize more than just the odd symbol and computer code. Looking back, the brunette knew that if she'd just double-checked the contents of the boxes she'd moved to the fair, none of this would have happened. It was obvious now that the containers had been too light to carry all the prototypes that Mai had decided were good enough to be showcased at the fair. The crazed inventor had taken all the really good ones to compete with anyway. For all this, expulsion was the least of the duo's fears, however. I'm so sorry, Mai shouted, bowing down. As the inventor, it was her prerogative to make sure situations like this never happened. She should never have betrayed the trust given to her. It's my fault that Ichi's gear fell into someone else's hands. Sensei told me, he said nothing made with Ichi or his ideas was to be used at the fair. And Ichi told me himself he didn't want his gear in the hands of bad people. For the first time in years, Mai found her superhuman sight clouded by tears. Being expelled was nothing. She could survive that, find another studio. She could even build one herself if she had to. But just imagining Ichi calling her a traitor, ending their partnership, their friendship. "It wasn't your fault," screamed, tearing up instantly when she saw Mai break down. She couldn't bear the guilt of causing such suffering to her first school friend. "It was my fault for not double-checking the prototypes. I should have known those bee babies in those boxes weren't meant for the fair, but I put them on display anyway. Mr. Flu, principal. If anyone should be punished for this, it should be me, not my friend." Kid feared pain, especially the pain of losing those she loved, but she feared the idea of hurting them even more. While her relationship with the mad inventor had started for all the wrong reasons, and had led to many clashes and headaches, they'd finally been able to click. Losing Mai now would be just as unbearable as losing anyone from her guild. Staring at the two profusely apologizing young women, Nezu found it incredibly hard not to burst into bellowing laughter. It warmed his cynical heart, seeing such humility and desire to protect one's friends, but now was really not the time. And not the reason they were here. Yes, the two had made their mistakes. Yes, they'd gone against his, and Midoriya's, wishes in a sense. But the end result had ultimately benefited his academy, and thus, his students. For once fate had been kind, and the one Mai had sold her inventions to had been the JSDF, and not some shady mercenary group. While it's true you two shouldn't have showcased those items, you won't be punished for this infraction, Nezu said, causing both young women to choke on their still flowing apologies and self-blaming. The JSDF and our academy have always worked together, if not so publicly. Who do you think builds them there? Anti-Kaiju assault modules? Them taking an interest in your inventions causes no harm, it only deepens the bond we share. Of course, Nezu wasn't being completely honest. While it was true a bond was there, it was severely limited to providing the earlier mentioned ACOMs, lending a helping hand during disaster relief operations, and occasionally sending third years to learn more hands-on approaches, to join to rescue operations. That last one was mandatory, actually. Now that they were in a position where there was no more private funding, having the JSDF investing more into the school was a lifesaver. So. Couldn't speak, she couldn't even think. She'd been so sure. Did we do good? In the end? Most of the time, her clumsiness only helped her out in her game. In real life, her handicap had led to many painful and/or embarrassing moments, like taking a basketball to the face because she'd forgotten she was in the real world again and had tried to activate a game skill, or standing in front of a vending machine with a line behind her while she wondered why her inventory menu wouldn't pop up so she could spend money for a snack. "Izuku won't be mad at me?" Mai asked, voice tremulous with both fear and hope. Nezu snorted, causing both young women to jump. "While I can't speak for Midoriya-san, I don't think he will be," the quirked animal replied, chuckling. Truly, he should call up first years to his office more often. Their reactions were so enjoyable. Although, as the principal dragged out what he meant to say, both Mai and Kid began to feel the stirrings of fear rising within them again. Surely there had to be some sort of punishment for their actions? They'd put items explicated forbidden for public consumption on display. By the glowing baby they'd actually sold those items. Without both inventors' full consent even. General Hazama and the Prime Minister were quite impressed with what they've seen so far. But now they're expecting you two to either improve on your prototypes and create mission-ready models, or come up with additional prototypes to further round out the kits you've already created, Nezu said, laying down both reward and punishment in one. It was one of the quirked animal's most favorite ways of educating. As do I, make no mistake. Your continued work will not only benefit this school, but now, the entire country of Japan. So, then, go on, carry on with your crusade of making even better gear. With that, both girls gave hasty nods and fled his office. Nezu took a moment, before collapsing back into his chair. What did it say about him, that he was asking such young minds to turn to such impossibilities? Hatsume and Hanjo had already created gear that was by all rights some of the most useful UA had ever produced in its support studio. Expanding foam bullets for easy captures, bulletproof fabric that so far showed no signs of causing cancer, smart glasses light and inconspicuous enough to be confused for bargain brands, and a nutrition bar that would doubtlessly save thousands of those starving the world over. Asking for more was honestly unreasonable. But those two were already unreasonable, weren't they? Maybe it was alright to believe they could throw together more inventions that would help save his school's budget. UA main campus, support studio, later that morning. It hadn't taken long for the pair of inventors to realize the enormity of their task. They weren't making babies to impress wannabe heroes, or even hypothetical pros this time. They were crafting gear for the JSDF. Any pretensions, a flashy sheet that sparkled and made strange sounds just for the hell of it, were immediately thrown out the window. Mai stared at her blank idea board in consternation. Why weren't the ideas flowing? She needed to make babies with raw utility, sheer reliability, outstanding durability. She just needed a spark of inspiration. She needed Ichi. Speeding her way through the labyrinthian depths of the support studio, where she and good special developments were to be created, Mai made her way toward the large steel doors that marked the border between her world and everything else. Why was that fount of inspiration known as the Emerald Necromancer always so far away? Thankfully, she no longer had to worry about her partner keeping up with her, the brunette only a step behind. When the two got close enough, the massive doors opened, springing into action through the wonder of their hydraulics. And that's when I said, "Now that's okay, Tana." Ichi's voice immediately echoed through the halls and reached both inventors' ears at the same time. What luck! Rushing into the hallway, Mai saw Ichi and his group of other friends laughing at some hidden meaning behind his completely innocent words. Quick as a flash, or a guided subsonic missile, Mai tackled her Ichi to the ground, overcome with excitement. Ichi! Ichi! The pink-haired inventor screamed at the top of lungs, squeezing the verde net with all her strength while atop him. Yes, Ak, yes, that's me. Izuku moaned, feeling his ribs protest the sudden pressure being exerted upon them. Why couldn't he get up? Something really heavy was on top of him. Although that's not exactly my name. Forcing his eyes open, the verde net realized there it was just Mai. Wait. Mai was on top of him. You have to help me. Mai all but shouted, her eyes full of happiness and something else. Izuku couldn't hold her still long enough to decipher. Please. Please. I need you. I need you right now. Oh look, Tsu-chan was pouting. That couldn't be good. What? Izuku asked, having no idea what was going on, save that his girlfriend wasn't looking too happy, and was turning red. Please help me make some babies. Izuku would forever remember that day as the most embarrassing moment of his life. Chapter 40, Sinister Special 5. Lady Luck's Smile, for Laurel. Shoto Todoroki sat at the far edge of a crowded public plaza, exasperated beyond measure with the situation he was currently being made to suffer through. 2 months. If he could survive 2 more months, he'd be enrolled at UA. While it was true him graduating from the esteemed hero school was just another part of the bastard's plan to turn him into a weapon capable of dethroning All Might and cementing his own place in history by proxy, the dual-haired teen truly did desire to attend the famous heroic academy. It was all part of his own plan. He'd rise to prominence while showing the world his mother's magnificent blessing. And he'd leave the bastard's curse to rot in his shadow while doing it. Bastard. Should have known he'd find a way to steal one more thing from me. Shoto hissed, seething as he sat alone at his bench. Now that I'm being forced to take the recommendation exam instead of the regular one, I'll just have to find some other way to begin proclaiming the power of Mother's blessing to the masses. Shoto's lifelong torture, what others would ignorantly call training, had always mainly focused on the physical side of things. He knew without a doubt he could muscle through most obstacles with little trouble thanks to the bastard's obsession with power. But that had never been enough for him. He'd studied diligently, in secret, to ace UA infamous written exam as well. It had always been a simple plan. He'd ace both the written and practical exams, entirely on his own, with only his mother's blessing, and show he had everything it took to be a hero without his curse. But then the bastard had declared he'd be entering UA through recommendation. His recommendation. I don't need his help. Shoto muttered, ignoring the world around him to stew in his slowly building frustration and anger. I don't need him, his recommendation, or his curse. Even worse than being denied the chance to prove his conviction through rightful effort had been the smug and utterly condescending grin the bastard had sported when he delivered the news of his recommended status. As if anything and everything done in the name of pushing Shoto toward the goal of surpassing All Might was doing him an incomparable favor. That's right, I'm Endeavor, the number 2 hero, and this is my favorite. The voice of the bastard rose over the noise of the crowded plaza, boosted by specially tuned mix. The sound alone fed the ravenous fires of rebellion that burned hotly in Shoto's heart. They were the only flames he'd ever allow himself to light. That and those of his hatred. He hated that he had no voice, no vote in how his life was run. He hadn't been allowed to reject the recommendation, hadn't lived together with his siblings in years, hadn't been allowed to develop his own style of combat, hadn't ever been able to even speak of visiting his mother. The heterochromatic teen clenched his teeth. His life, with not even a modicum of freedom or agency, was it really even his life, or an extension of the bastard's? Even when he had no reason to be at the stupid outing the bastard had arranged with today's advertisement sponsor, hadn't cared to know who or what it was about, he hadn't been allowed to pass on attending. He didn't even know where he was right now. Were they in Tokyo? Kyoto? Wait, Mr. Balloon. The sudden girlish scream caught Shoto's attention by virtue of being a fair excuse to cease paying any level of faux attention to the bastard's antics in front of the camera crews. Don't go. Stop. Eyes darting around, Shoto finally caught sight of the owner of the screaming voice. It was a girl, around his age, with long dark pink hair tied into 4 tails and the rest cascading down to around her mid-back. She had clear, sky-blue eyes that would have likely been nice to look at had they not currently been filled with panic. Remaining in his seat at the bench, Shoto decided focusing on the girl would be better than wasting another moment on the bastard, and began to analyze this new situation. Mr. Balloon. Quite obviously, the girl was chasing after the bluish balloon that was floating away from her. Each time she almost grabbed its trailing cord, the girl tripped or slipped on something, however, leading Shoto to believe she was inherently clumsy. Then the heterochromatic teen saw a small child running after the pink-haired girl, and more of the story revealed itself. He could see that the child was crying as they ran, grasping with empty hands at the air. Shoto connected the dots easily enough and realized the older girl was trying to do a good deed by recovering the balloon that the child had most likely lost somehow. It would have been easier to just buy a new one, Shoto muttered, eyeing the situation from his spot. And the kid should have had the cord tied around their wrist anyway. Watching as the girl and child ran in circles trying to catch their lost prize, Shoto entertained possible scenarios that would solve the rather pointless conundrum before him. UGH. Instead of tripping, the pink-haired girl's latest misfortune had her run into a lamppost of all things. Using his mother's gift, Shoto calculated that he could easily cool down the air inside the balloon, causing it to slowly drop to the ground or at least arm's reach. Almost. The pink-haired girl dived, missing the balloon by a finger length before ramming headfirst into a line of bushes. If he wanted to go extreme, really plus ultra, Shoto supposed he could also create an ice dome around the balloon. It would ensure the balloon couldn't escape, but it would be such a waste of energy for such a pointless. Damn, now he was thinking like the bastard. On chance stop. Don't. The sudden high-pitched scream from the child snapped Shoto back to the present. It took him a split second to take in the scene and realize what had happened. The pink-haired girl, still covered in bits of vegetation, had chased the balloon once again. Right into the street. Gotcha! The girl shouted, triumph coloring her cheeks as she grinned widely when her hands finally snared the balloon's cord. She blinked, seemingly realizing she'd lost track of where she was during the hunt. Turning slightly, she looked to the side, just as a truck came barreling down the road straight for her. Ha-oo-oo-oo-oo-ook. The pink-haired girl squeezed her eyes shut. It happened too fast for most to see. Ha-oo-oo-oo-ook. Ah-ah-ah. Shriek. There was an immense explosion of cold. Crash bang. It took a moment, but the pink-haired girl opened her eyes. The truck had hit a giant ice wall. She was alive. As the girl slid to the ground in shock, the bystanders began to gather, attracted by the averted tragedy. Many had watched the young girl as she chased the balloon around, amused at her haplessness, but none there could understand the actions of the truck driver. The large vehicle hadn't even tried to stop, let alone slow down or change course. As more and more people talked about such suspicious behavior, the murmurings grew in volume. "Are you all right?" Shoto asked, staring not at the girl he'd saved but at the truck he'd just totaled. He wasn't overly concerned for the stranger's health, the question coming as more of a reflex than anything. Hero etiquette was a thing in the world after all. And while his lessons in it hadn't been as harsh as his physical trainings, the heterochromatic teen still fell back on them when he didn't really know how to proceed in a situation. The clumsy pink-haired girl sat up, teary-eyed and red-faced, but said nothing. That was enough response for Shoto though, and he moved toward the truck, intent on questioning the driver who'd almost killed someone, accident or not. Unfortunately, when he rounded the vehicle to the driver's side, the bastard had already appeared, holding the driver up by the collar of his shirt. "I swear!" the man shouted in a panic, visibly pissing himself while in the grip of the number 2 hero. "I just closed my eyes for a second, honest. Then there was an ice wall in front of me. I couldn't do anything." Falling asleep while driving? How monotonous. The bastard could have that case. Making his way back to the girl, Shoto came to a stop beside her unnoticed, as she appeared mesmerized by his ice wall. "Come on, let's go over there," Shoto said, offering a hand. The dazed girl took it thoughtlessly, shivering as their skin touched. As the two moved back to the bench Shoto had been sitting at earlier, the heterochromatic teen began to wonder why he had suddenly gone the extra step with this girl. He didn't know this girl, nor particularly care for her health. Taking stock of the situation again, he decided it must have been because dealing with her was better than spending any more time around the bastard. The two took a seat, and instantly began to drown under an awkward silence. "So," Shoto said, trying and failing to start a conversation. It was at that moment that the scion of the Todoroki realized he'd never struck up or held a conversation with anyone before, much less a girl he'd only just met. How did one talk to girls? What did he talk to Fuimi about when they'd last spoke? When had they last spoke? "I'm sorry for troubling you," the girl suddenly said, breaking the uncomfortable atmosphere between the two. "Truck-kun has been trying to get me ever since I manifested my quirk. I always seem to get away somehow, but a literal wall of ice is a new one." "That was you, right?" For the heavily sheltered Shoto, the idea of someone using such an honorific on a vehicle of all things was exceedingly confusing. People were strange. "Ah. Yes," Shoto said, managing to force the words out of the quagmire that was his incredibly limited social experience. "It's a part of my mother's gift." The heterochromatic teen had to lean back suddenly as the girl turned to gaze at him with stars in her eyes. "You inherited your mom's quirk?" she asked, smiling widely. "That's so cool." For a moment, Shoto felt like he had finally advanced one step closer to his dream, to show the world the blessing that was his mother's gift, that the curse he also held was better left forgotten. "Oh no. I forgot to introduce myself," the girl said, bonking herself on the head in a playful manner judging by the grin she still wore. My name is Sakura Minamoto, and my quirk is called Jinx. From there, the conversation evolved into a mostly one-sided affair. Sakura regaled a half-listening Shoto about her quirk's unpredictability and the messes it always created due to the field of affected probability she projected because of it. The only time the girl ever lost her smile was when she brought up the misfortunes others had suffered due to Jinx. Worse, the quirk wasn't entirely controllable by the sound of it. Sakura complained about her inability to activate it at will as well. Jinx fired off whenever she felt emotional distress, which for a young teen seemed to include, but was not limited to, school exams, being yelled at, being late to literally anything, hand-holding, and of course, being unable to help a crying child. To Shoto, it sounded like a powerful emitter-type quirk. It was too bad there was no apparent way to control it. So, Shoto trailed off, realizing too late that trying to take control of the conversation with his level of sociability had been a bad idea. Are you applying to UA? It was a dumb question, that much even he was aware of. Who wouldn't apply to UA if given half a chance? Thankfully, the giggling from next to him eased the heterochromatic teen's nerves a little bit. No way, Sakura replied, smiling good-naturedly. Only the best and brightest go for UA and the most heroic. That was true, Shoto realized. UA was the best hero academy of Japan and, unless something changed by the time the next international scholastic rankings came out this year, the Eastern Hemisphere as well. While everyone of age might want to apply to UA, only those strong and brave enough to seriously attempt to do so. No, I'm aiming for an arts school instead, Sakura continued, the pinkette calmly smiling as she imagined all the different places she wanted to try enrolling to. Singing and dancing are the things I enjoy doing the most. I really think, if I work hard enough, if I give it my very best, maybe, just maybe, I might even be able to reach the status of idol someday. As his newest acquaintance revealed her dream, sparkling eyes and all, Shoto couldn't help but think to himself that this was the dumbest idea the pinkette could have ever entertained. If her quirk really activated without warning whenever she underwent emotional duress, then there was no way it wouldn't activate whenever she went on stage, especially if she was aiming to become an idol. With a slowly building rambling going on beside him, Shoto thought of the ways to assemble an explanation regarding the irrationality and impossibility of his acquaintance's dream. Surely he could think of something better for her to do, something that would minimize the destruction her quirk could accidentally cause. Maybe gardening? Shoto. The sudden shout cut through the heterochromatic teen's thoughts as easily as it stopped the rambling of the girl sitting next to him. Endeavor, most likely now finished with the driver of the truck, had finally deigned to go find his weapon. What exactly do you think you're doing? The number 2 hero asked as he approached, flames already roaring to a degree his words had to be shouted. And who the hell is that person next to you supposed to be? Both teens panicked. As much as Shoto loathed the bastard with every fiber of his being, as much as he truly and wholly desired to pay him back for every painful beating he'd ever received, years of physical abuse at the hands of the man before him instantly set his survival instincts into go mode as it were. No one knew just how dangerous the flame hero really was better than him after all. All Sakura could do was let out an adorable yelp, close her eyes, and cover her head with her hands in the feeble hope that such a weak move would be enough to protect her from harm. She didn't know why the number 2 hero was here, or why he was so mad, but she did know her previous happiness had taken a sharp turn to outright terror. Then, the most baffling thing Shoto ever witnessed occurred right before his dual-colored eyes. Like out of a skit of a bad comedy, Endeavor, the bastard himself, slipped on a banana peel. While the impossibility of finding such trash in a public plaza in one of Japan's nicer districts was already grounds for calling out some sort of black magic forgery, watching the massive dumpster fire of a man fall backwards the entire way to the ground and hit his head on the concrete hard enough for his flames to go out was enough of a shock to ignore that fact. So, when you say your quirk brings misfortune, Shoto mumbled, failing to contain the small grin forcing its way onto his face. "Eh?" Sakura opened her eyes, taking only a second to realize the weirdness of the situation was a clear sign her quirk had fired off again without her permission. "Oh no. I'm so sorry." Once more, the bystanders who'd been watching the scene unfold from the safety of the sidelines began to descend on the pair of teens. This was even more suspicious to the gathering public than a truck driver supposedly falling asleep at the wheel and almost killing a girl. "Don't be sorry," Shoto interrupted the panicking girl beside him. He had enjoyed one example of her quirk, sure, but he didn't want to risk Jinx going off again if he could help it. "I'm not. And it wasn't your fault anyway." Shoto. The bastard was already getting back to his feet. And if the size and heat of his flames were any indication, he was positively enraged. "Well shit. Let's go." Shoto hissed suddenly, taking Sakura by the hand. The abrupt action caused the pinkette to begin panicking again. For a split second, the fleeing scion of the Todoroki looked back as he retreated, freely letting his grin blossom this time as the bastard managed to slip on the same banana peel for a second time. He knew he was going to be receiving quite the beating when he eventually returned to the bastard's home, his prison, but for once, he would openly admit that all of this was entirely worth it. Who knew helping a complete stranger with crazy dreams could be so gratifying? "Magnus, I'm not sorry for the references used, so I won't ask for forgiveness. Deal with it." Omake, the fall from glory. Takeo Go, once the proud scientific genius known as Nanoman, worked diligently at completing his newest duties, even as he loathed them. Or rather, even as he loathed them, taking his time so that he couldn't focus on his true, more important goal. Starting test. Now. Sample number 3, the giant of a man said in monotone as he began to write on the empty lab paper next to him. Running blank concurrently for comparison. Minutes ago, the once renounced scientist had gotten his hands on samples from one Kyo Ukijiro. It had been a surprise miracle, and while the near-death experience of a student would always give him pause, the mountainous man would gladly accept such an occurrence happening again if it brought him something he'd been aching desperately for. Another chance to study cursed blood. The quirk may have brought his baby back to life, but it had also enchained his dear Misao to the Midoriya brat. And that was unforgivable. "Good, good," Recovery Girl replied absent-mindedly, sucking on one of her gummy bear treats. "It's always best to ensure everything is well." From his place beside the lab's equipment, Takeo eyed his beloved sensei with sorrow. He hadn't wanted to admit it, to face reality, but there was no ignoring the truth now. The elderly nurse, the so-called backbone of UA, had long been succumbing to her old age. In silence, alone, she'd slowly gone senile until her adult mind rebelled and ultimately betrayed her true nature, morals, and ethics. Discovering a quirk anomaly such as cursed blood probably hadn't helped, or was perhaps the infamous straw to the camel's back, as the Americans would say. The green brat had fired all of the wrong neurons with his old teacher, bringing out the worst, ugliest parts of scientific potential in Chio. Every interaction with him afterwards had only worsened the degradation of her psyche as well, soon leading to the sorry state of the once implacable Recovery Girl. If Takeo was honest with himself, which he refused to be when it came to the monster keeping his little Misao in servitude, the Midoriya brat hadn't had any way of knowing his existence would cause the downfall of such an important figure. Anything could have set Chio off as her dementia had gotten worse. Eventually there would have been another straw, it would have been inevitable. "Sensei, don't forget to take your nap," Takeo said suddenly, taking just a moment from his observation to glance at the elderly heroine. "The doctor said to not overwork yourself, remember?" The mountain man blamed what was happening to his beloved sensei now on the so-called doctor who'd ultimately diagnosed her after their discussion with Nezu. The overly inflated legendary heaven canceller should have chosen a better way to deal with Recovery Girl's malady. One such as him should have had some obscure treatment, or unheard-of drug that could have helped her. The man was known across the world for quirk's sake. Instead, The fraud had settled on giving Chiyoshuzenji, his sensei and the best real healer Japan had ever had, drug-laced candies. The medicine kept her calm and focused, but at the price of dulling the intrepid heroine's sense of discovery and experimentation. It had turned Recovery Girl into a caring grandmother whose only driving interest was tending to the injuries of her patients. Sure. Chio harumphed in reply, I'll just do a round to see my current patients before going to my office. Please take care of the rest for me while I'm gone, Tak-kun. Perhaps this was for the best. Yue needed a recovery girl focused on caring, on doing her job. Long past were the days when the academy could afford for her to indulge in wild experimentations on students, assured she could always fix any problems that arose from her work. And in truth, Takeo needed time alone to experiment on his own. While his data on cursed blood was minimal at best, it still provided him with invaluable insight on organic programming and cellular interaction. Of course, he still needed more information though. Right now, the current goal was discovering how the quirk-born microorganisms bonded to their hosts to grant their ridiculous regeneration powers. Results of scans are as follows: hematocrit and antigen markings. Takeo trailed off as he read over the results from the machine beside him. Are all normal? Takeo stared at the printed results in disbelief. He blinked, and looked again, for a third time. The blood samples from the Jiro girl were still there. Still normal. Impossible. Izuku Midoriya had saved Kyoukajiro from terrible, irreparable injury thanks to the timely use of his cursed blood quirk. The event had been recorded, documented, and proven. With permission from the girl's parents, blood samples had been taken for a battery of tests to ensure that there were no lingering effects from their daughter being nearly frozen and summarily healed by a still largely unknown quirk. Takeo had expected to find instances of the little demonic-looking microorganisms swimming about, if not in large quantities, then at least some visible trace that would indicate past occupancy. Instead, not a single cell was pinging as being out of place. Not a single parameter of the machine read any part of the girl's blood as being abnormal, alien, or otherwise anything other than all natural. There wasn't a single piece of evidence from his samples that would say cursed blood had ever been used on the Jiro girl. It was as if cursed blood had decided that it didn't want to be seen by his tests anymore. As if it wanted to fork with him. No matter. Takeo muttered as he wrote the results on the girl's file. One day I'll find out the truth about you, you little sheets. And when I do, I'll finally free my little Masao from you and your master. Recovery Girl may have lost her drive for experimentation, but he was far from done. On his oath to free his child, still as strong as the day he'd returned to Japan, Takeo wouldn't rest until he'd unlocked the secrets of the so-called cursed blood of Izuku Midoriya. Oh, make a cute little mistake. Izuku had never considered himself what one would call a genius. He liked to believe he was studious, sure, and that he was good at learning and picking up new information that interested him. But he'd never enjoyed it when others had praised him for his brainpower. Unfortunately, such praise had been much more freely given since he'd entered UA for some reason. From high praises from Momo, his class's president, to backslaps from his class's idiot Kaminari, Izuku had suffered his unparalleled intelligence being brought up day after day in one form or another. Eventually, he couldn't help but begin to wonder if, perhaps, his brain just worked a little bit differently from the norm. Boss, do we really need to be here, in this class? Saki asked, tone making it clear the blonde delinquent found the upcoming period of the school day unbearable to even think about. I mean, I dominate the subject, Sharmpy's better than the whole class at it, and Wonder Girl doesn't even need it. Eck, you're better at it than the sub we've been stuck with. Unfortunately, Izuku replied with obvious distaste, aptitude doesn't equal special treatment. Naturally high intelligence and the ability to learn at accelerated rates sometimes brought about unintended consequences. It was bad enough that Izuku had to force himself to daydream whenever he finished written exams far earlier than his classmates, but after devouring every textbook for the hero course's curriculum a month ago, the Verdanet had found himself faced with a most dreadful problem. UA didn't allow students to skip their classes, especially not if they were heroic students. Very well class, let's begin. A rather unkempt woman with long, wild black hair and thick-rimmed glasses wearing a simple white blouse, a black skirt, and a trench coat of, all things called out, gathering 1A's attention. And remember, no Japanese from now until the bell. It wasn't the woman's fault at all, but the dreaded class she was temporarily taking over for the duration of present Mick's suspension due to his less than subtle quirkish remarks during the first year's sports festival was the bane of existence for many of the students now under her care. The young men and women all feared the subject, for it was insanity, chaos, and bitten tongues all rolled into one. It was English class. The foreign language had made a strong comeback as a world constant after the reunification of the USA. The subject had gradually made its way back into the curriculum of every school the world over, being especially mandatory for hero courses as the lingua franca for international heroics due to its universality before the quirk era and low difficulty to learn. For Izuku, the class was an absolute nightmare, but not for the same reasons as it was for his classmates. Midoriya-san, no daydreaming in class. The substitute teacher was quick to throw out her now customary jab to the advanced Verdanet in what Izuku knew to be highly polished English. It was almost like the heroine known as the paper was a natural speaker of the language. I know you believe you know enough English as it is, but there's always room for improvement. Yes ma'am, Izuku replied, failing to hide his grimace at being forced to pay attention to the monotony of the woman's lecture. I'll pay attention. Normally, present Mick wouldn't give Izuku a second look after he'd speed through the day's lesson and move on to his own work. Normally, the Verdanet's close friends would give him looks of sympathy for being called out like that. Normally, those same friends weren't struggling to understand every other word their teacher said or the homework given. It said something about the level of competence with the infernal language paper sensei expected them to have, that even Tsu-chan, who had higher than average experience with English thanks to her mother's work, was struggling. The woman had clearly forgotten they were all just first years, and only variants such as Izuku himself and Momo were able to follow her rapid-fire lessons with ease. Okay then. Now that we're all focused, let's finish the basics before the end of the week so we can move on, Paper Sensei began, huffing as she looked out at 1A and realized that more than half hadn't understood much of what she'd said. Honestly, one would expect you all to be at an intermediate level here before you had even entered this academy. However, for some reason, many of you act as if your knowledge of English is below even basic levels. How do you expect to collaborate with foreign heroes? The Rand continued, masterfully poking at the wounded prides of the 1A students. It was an old trick, but as they say, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. As I hope you all know, English is divided into grades, and you're all expected to be at the top level by the end of your second year. At the latest, Paper Sensei was relentless with her teaching, a far cry from her rather gentle demeanor outside of class. To the likes of those such as Denki Kaminari and Hantasero, this wasn't such a good thing, even if they knew the extra drive would eventually aid their own learning. The two wore troubled faces, looks shared by most of their classmates, as they and many others struggled with inflection and, glowing baby forbid, tenses. In the back of the classroom, Izuku knew from previous classes that Momo wasn't struggling in the slightest, understanding Paper Sensei with ease although she still took copious amounts of notes. Kyauka and Fumikage, likewise, seemed at ease, though the Verdanet was sure as to where the couple's experience with the foreign language came from. Seeing Tsu-chan tense up periodically as she tried to follow along gave him concern, but hopefully he'd be able to help his girlfriend with anything she had trouble with after class during their alone time. Next to the young necromancer, his trio of partners was handling the monotony in their own ways. Saki had made it clear the first day Paper Sensei had walked in the door that she wouldn't be taking the class seriously. That and the fact that she wasn't technically a student were probably the only reasons the substitute hadn't wasted any time on the blonde. Tay was, well, staring off into the infinite, and no amount of calling on her by anyone save Izuku could get her to stop as long as the class was in session. In order to understand how far you all have to go, you need to understand how many grades you need to advance, Paper Sensei continued, drawing Izuku back to the present from where his mind had wandered. Even after promising to pay attention, the boredom had quickly driven him into his thoughts. The grades are 1 to 5 and, just as Izuku bowed his head in resignation, a small miracle occurred. What happened to the rest? The interrupting question, asked by the adorable Lily of all people, caused Paper Sensei to pause and the class as a whole to stare at the brunette in confusion. Lily tilted her head to the side in response. What? Lily asked, looking criminally cute as she frowned and stared back at all the eyes on her. Realizing she'd slipped into Japanese, the littlest zombie switched back to the required language. 1, 2, and 5? What happened to 3 and 4? Izuku immediately caught on to what had happened, and from the sound of a slap of a hand over mouth heard behind him, Momo had as well. Paper Sensei had opted to use 2 instead of 3 when attempting to describe the levels of English competency. As it was better than his brain-killing boredom, the Verdana decided to let the substitute deal with situation she'd caused. The rest of the students were struggling at the scene in their own ways. As Izuku had guessed, Momo was covering her mouth to stifle a squeal. Tsu's cheeks had inflated, which only her friends knew was a sign of her silencing her own laughter. Kyauka was sniggering so quietly only she could hear herself. Fumikage was motionless, but the hand over his stomach made it clear to anyone watching the edgy teen that he was keeping his quirk from busting out to laugh for the both of them. Then, Yoraraka snorted, and that set off many other giggles and chortling. What? Did Lily mess up? Lily asked, innocent eyes glancing with growing distress between the numerous members of UA as they either failed or succeeded in containing their laughter. No. Lily couldn't have messed up. Could she? Paper Sensei blinked, a hand that had shot into her trench coat pocket at Lily's question coming out, to scratch at her messy hair. The woman's eyes widened as she finally Could she? Paper Sensei blinked, a hand that had shot into her trench coat pocket at Lily's question coming out, to scratch at her messy hair. The woman's eyes widened as she finally realized where the confusion had come from and, unused to censoring herself around students, she snorted as well. The class of 1A devolved fully into good-natured laughter and squeals of adoration for the antics of the little undead idol. Those closest to Lily gave the littlest zombie innumerable head pats, which went far in making the brunette feel better about the faux pas she'd accidentally made. As the class eventually got a hold of itself, many shared the same thought. Lily really did make things better. Much, much better.